Hey everyone, it's Michael from michaeldrewmusic.com. I thought today we would talk about reading pitch. Now, reading music, that is no small task. There is a lot to it, and just like learning to read or write a language, it takes many years of practice and experience to really get good at it. But I thought today we would put together 4 basic tips that will get you started with reading music, especially if you're new to music or new to reading. This, I think, will be a great place to start. So let's split the screen. We're going to read some music today. Number 1, lines and spaces. So when we read music, the first thing that we see is we see our clef. Now, in general terms, if we take all the notes in music, we split them right in half. The higher half, that would be the treble clef. And the lower half, that's the bass clef. Now, there are other clefs. There's more that we could say about that, but that's basically how we want to think of it. Okay, now most instruments are only going to read one of the 2 clefs. However, for the sake of today's video, I'm using the grand staff, which has both treble and bass clef. That way, if you play a treble clef instrument, if you play a bass clef instrument, this video will be relevant to you. And if you play piano, that's the instrument that's going to read the grand staff. It's going to read both treble and bass clef. So that way we've got everything covered here. Now you'll notice that each clef sits on 5 lines, and that's called the staff. And that is where our notes reside. That is how we read pitch. And when we are reading pitch, every note will either be on a line or on a space. Okay, so we have 2 kinds of notes that we're reading, line notes and space notes. So that's the first question I would ask yourself is this a line note or is this a space note? Now, when we're reading pitch, we are reading the musical alphabet. We're reading the naturals or the letter names in music, A through G. These are the white keys on the piano. Remember that the sharps and flats, they are considered alterations of the naturals. So they don't get their own line or space on the staff, only the naturals do. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. One goal for reading music would be to memorize what notes are on the lines and what notes are on the spaces for each clef. And that's what I thought we would do right now. So there are some age-old piano teacher sayings that I think are helpful. So let's start with the treble clef. Okay, so the treble clef has 5 lines, and we've got a saying that's a rhyme. If the note is on the line, every good boy does fine. Or if I'm teaching guitar, I might say, every guitarist begins doing fine. The idea there is that you take the first letter of each word, and it gives you the 5 lines. All right, so what we're looking to do is we're looking to memorize E, G, B, D, F. So maybe it's easier just to remember that or to write that down, or maybe the rhyme is helpful, but we need to know E, G, B, D, F, the 5 lines from bottom to top on the treble clef. Those are the notes that are on those lines. For the spaces, we have another rhyme. If the note is on the space, F-A-C-E spells face. So again, from bottom to top, those are our 4 space notes on the treble clef, F-A-C-E. Now moving to the bass clef, I like to use animal sayings. So if we look at the lines for the bass clef, we've got good birds don't fly away, or great big dogs fight animals. G, B, D, F, A. That's what we need to know from bottom to top again. Those are the 5 line notes for the bass clef. Now, if we talk about spaces, my personal favorite, all cows eat grass. A, C, E, G, those are our 4 space notes in the bass clef. So that's step number 1, is when you're reading music, is it a line note or is it a space note? And then which line or space is it on? If you can answer those 2 questions, you ought to be able to use these sayings to figure out what that pitch is. Here's a couple of quick examples. What note is on the 4th line of the treble clef? Okay, let's say we don't know what that note is. We go 4th line, every good boy does, D, that's a D. What note is on the 2nd space of the bass clef? 2nd space, okay. All cows, that's a C. So that's the idea. Hopefully this will help you identify notes, and of course as you read more and practice more, you will become automatic at this. You'll be able to do this without using the sayings, but if you're new to reading, I think it's a good place to start. Number 2, steps and skips. So now that we've discussed line notes and space notes, let's take a look at different patterns of notes that we may see in a piece of music. If we see a pattern where notes are going from a line to a space to a line to a space, that means we are going in order across the musical alphabet, right? So like if I start on the bottom line, which is the note E in the treble clef, and I go to the next space, there will be to F, and then the next line, next space, next line. Now notice here on the piano that I am playing every single white key. I'm not skipping any white keys. I'm going in a row. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about stepping. I'm talking about stepping from one note to the next note to the next note to the next note with nothing missed in the middle. Okay, and that's going to appear on the staff as line space, line space, line space. Now, if we talk about skipping, skipping would be line to line or space to space. So if I start on that same note E, and instead of going to the next space, I go to the next line, there's G, next line, B, next line, D, okay? So you can see what I'm doing now is I'm missing the notes on the piano. I'm missing every other note, just like we're missing the space notes on the staff. Okay, so line to line to line means we're skipping space notes. Same thing if we see space to space to space. You know, if I start on the bottom space of the treble clef, here's F, A, C, E, and again, you can see I'm missing the line notes in between. So if you see patterns that are going from space to the very next space up or down, you know you're missing a note in the middle. If you see line to line, same thing. If you see line to space or space to line, that's stepping. You're going to the very next note, whether it be up or down. Number 3, learn to recognize intervals. Okay, so we've talked about line notes and space notes. We've talked about going from line to line or space to space. What about if we have a larger jump? You know, what if we have a note that's on the bottom line and then a note that's way up on the 4th line, something like that? That's where intervals come in. Now, if you haven't yet seen my video on intervals, please check that out. I will have that linked up top right now, and that will give you a deep dive into the interval. But basically, an interval is the distance between two notes. And so we can learn to recognize those intervals from reading certain patterns of lines and spaces. Okay, so here's what I mean. Thirds, fifths, and sevenths match in terms of lines and spaces. Okay, so a third, that's a skip. We already talked about that. That would be line to the next line up. A fifth would be a line note, and then skipping a line, and then the next line up. Okay, and then a seventh would be a line note, and then skipping 2 line notes, and then the next line up. Same thing for spaces. Okay, so a third could be a space to the next space, a space skipping a space, and the next space would be a fifth, etc. So again, thirds, fifths, and sevenths are going to be line to line or space to space. It's just a matter of how many lines or spaces are in between the notes. Okay, so what that means is that the other intervals, seconds, fourths, sixths, and octaves, those are not going to match. So a fourth, as an example, is going to go space to line or line to space. Octaves, that's a big one because octaves, there's such a big gap between the two notes there. Remember that octaves do not match. Okay, so if I have, going back to our example here of E on the bottom line and I play its octave, okay, that note is on the top space. Okay, so again, it's line to space. Now, it's easy to mix up octaves and sevenths because they're both big gaps between the notes. But if you can remember that octaves are line to space or space to line, sevenths are line to line or space to space. So if I play E and then I play it seventh, that matches, right? That's a line note to a line note. Same thing with spaces. If I play the note F here, its octave is on the top line. So again, space to line. If I play it seventh, that's the note E, that's on the top space. So thirds, fifths, sevenths match line to line or space to space. Seconds, fourths, sixths, and octaves do not match space to line or line to space. Number 4, learn the 5 C's. So what happens when we are reading music and the notes go too high or too low for the staff? What happens when we have to go higher than the 5 lines and the 4 spaces that we've talked about? That's where we get into ledger lines. So ledger lines are these little additional lines that are added to essentially extend the staff upwards or downwards when notes get too high or too low for the 5-line, 4-space staff that we've already talked about. The most famous of these ledger line notes is middle C. So middle C is right in the middle of the treble clef and the bass clef. Okay, so this is one ledger line below the treble clef and one ledger line above the bass clef. Okay, and there it is. Now, this is really cool. There's a certain symmetry to the Cs as it relates to reading them that I would encourage you to lock into your memory. Okay, so middle C is right in between treble clef and bass clef there. It's that middle ledger line, okay? If we go 3 spaces up on the treble clef, we get the next C up. It's octave higher. Okay, if we go 3 spaces down on the bass clef, we get the next C lower. Okay, if we go 2 ledger lines above the treble clef, that's our next C up. And if we go 2 ledger lines below the bass clef, that is our next C down. Now, the vast majority of music is going to land in that range right there, kind of right in the middle of the piano. There are certainly some things that will be higher or lower, but for the most part, that's where the bulk of music is going to live. So if you can remember this pattern, middle C, the middle ledger line, 3 spaces up in the treble, 3 spaces down in the bass, 2 ledger lines above in the treble, 2 ledger lines below in the bass, all Cs, that is a great way to get your bearings if you're ever unsure about what a note is. This will especially help with ledger lines. So here's a very quick example. Let's say that I know that the 2 ledger lines above the treble clef, I know that that is a C. I know that's this note. Okay, so what about 3 ledger lines above? Well, we already talked about line to line is a skip, so I'm going to go E, right? There's my 3rd ledger line. G, there's my 4th ledger line. So learn the 5 Cs, memorize where they are. That's going to help you when notes go beyond the 5 lines and 4 spaces. Well, thank you everyone for reading some music with me today. If you found this helpful, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And as always, have a wonderful time playing and reading music, and I will see you next time.